The art director's debrief, special investigation, the 200-year trial of a banned masterpiece. Hello, and welcome back to the Emotive archive. Today, we are not beginning a new reading. Instead, we are opening a case file, a cold case that has remained open for over 2 centuries. We will be conducting a deep forensic analysis of a single work of art, a novel so infamous that its very existence was declared a crime, a book that was arrested, tried, and condemned, and whose author was thrown in prison for the act of writing it. The work in question is John Cleland's 1748 novel known to the world as Fanny Hill, or Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. For most, the name Fanny Hill is synonymous with one thing: pornography. It is often dismissed as the first great work of English erotica, a historical curiosity. But to see it only in that light is to miss the profound and revolutionary nature of the work and the epic legal and cultural battle that it ignited. In this special 2-part debrief, we will argue that Fanny Hill is far more than just a dirty book. It is a brilliant and subversive piece of social commentary, a surprisingly sophisticated literary experiment, and most importantly, the central exhibit in a 200-year-long trial that put the very definitions of art, censorship, and morality on the stand. In this first part, we will act as historical detectives, examining the scene of the crime, the vibrant, chaotic, and deeply hypocritical world of 18th century London that gave birth to this scandalous masterpiece. We will then analyze the initial crime itself, the publication, and the immediate violent reaction of the authorities that would set in motion a legal war lasting for generations. To understand the explosion that was Fanny Hill, we must first understand the volatile, alchemical mixture of the world that created it. The London of the 1740s was a city of explosive contradictions, a crucible where modernity was being forged. On one hand, this was the high noon of the Augustan age, the peak of the English Enlightenment. It was a world that celebrated reason, order, and classical harmony. Men like Alexander Pope were crafting perfectly balanced couplets. Samuel Johnson was preparing his great dictionary to codify the language, and architects were building elegant Palladian villas. It was an age that believed in logic, in the power of the human mind to understand and impose order upon the universe. This was the era of the gentleman philosopher, the scientific society, the refined coffee house debate. It was also, crucially, the dawn of the modern novel. The 1740s saw the publication of Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, massive, sprawling works that explored the inner lives and moral journeys of their characters with unprecedented psychological depth. A new, literate middle class was rising, hungry for stories that reflected their own experiences and anxieties. This was the polite, ordered, and intellectually vibrant surface of the age. But beneath this veneer of enlightened society lay a sprawling, chaotic, and often brutal underworld. This was the London of Hogarth's famous Prince, a city teeming with gin-soaked poverty, rampant crime, and a vast, highly organized and semi-public sex industry. Prostitution in 18th century London was not a hidden, shameful secret. It was a visible and integral part of the city's social and economic fabric. From the streetwalkers of Covent Garden to the high-class courtesans who were the mistresses of aristocrats and politicians, the woman of pleasure was a ubiquitous figure. Publications like Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies were popular annual guidebooks providing detailed, often witty reviews of individual prostitutes, their skills, their prices, and their physical attributes. It was a world where sexuality was both a commodity and a public spectacle, yet simultaneously a subject of intense moral panic and condemnation from religious and legal authorities. It was a society that was publicly pious and privately profligate. This profound hypocrisy is the fertile ground from which Fanny Hill grows. The novel did not invent a world of sexual commerce. It simply gave a voice, a narrative, and a startlingly human face to a world that everyone knew existed, but no one had dared to explore from the inside. Into this world steps our author, John Cleland. He was not a pornographer hiding in a garret. He was a man of the establishment, a product of the very system he was about to subvert. He was a well-educated man of letters, the son of a respected government official and a former diplomat who had served with the East India Company in Bombay. He had seen the world, but like many of his class, he lived beyond his means, and in 1748 he found himself imprisoned in Fleet Prison for an unpaid debt of £840, a staggering sum at the time. It was here, surrounded by the desperation and moral ambiguity of prison life, a microcosm of London's own underbelly, that he wrote Fanny Hill. The novel was published in 2 installments, and its success was immediate and explosive. It became an underground bestseller, a succès de scandale. But its success also drew the immediate, wrathful attention of the authorities. In November 1749, both Cleland and his publisher were arrested on charges of corrupting the king's subjects. This is where the trial of the book truly begins. What was Cleland's crime? On the surface, it was obscenity. The novel is, without question, sexually explicit. It contains detailed, though often highly euphemistic and metaphorical descriptions of a wide variety of sexual acts. But if that were its only crime, it would have been just another crude pamphlet, quickly forgotten. The true crime of Fanny Hill, the reason it was so uniquely threatening to the establishment, was not just its content, but its form and its radical philosophy. First, and most importantly, it was a novel. This was a new and powerful art form, the dominant cultural medium of the rising middle class. Unlike a simple pornographic chapbook, Fanny Hill used all the sophisticated literary techniques of the modern novel. It had a first-person narrator, a clear and engaging voice that invited the reader's sympathy. It had detailed character development, a coherent plot that followed Fanny's rise, fall, and eventual redemption. And it had a reflective, often philosophical tone. The language, while describing explicit acts, was rarely crude. Cleland was a master of euphemism and metaphor, using a rich, almost poetic vocabulary to describe the human body and its pleasures. The penis is a maypole, the vagina a sensitive plant. The act of sex is described with a language of scientific curiosity and aesthetic appreciation. By clothing its explicit content in the respectable, even beautiful robes of the novel, it threatened to break down the barrier between low pornography and high literature. It was a work of art that was also a work of obscenity, a dangerous and confusing hybrid that could not be easily dismissed. Second, and perhaps most subversively, was her narrator. For the first time in English literature, the story of a prostitute was told not from the perspective of a moralizing male observer, a detached social critic, or a repentant sinner looking back in shame. It was told from the first-person perspective of the woman herself, in the midst of her career, and with a startlingly lack of apology. Fanny Hill is not a tragic, fallen victim in the mold of Hogarth Moll Hackabout. She is an intelligent, articulate, and often humorous narrator of her own life. She is an economic agent, a woman who, upon arriving penniless in London, learns to use her sexuality not just to survive, but to thrive. She navigates the complex social and economic landscape of the London sex trade with a clear-eyed pragmatism. She is not a creature of sin, but a rational survivor, a student in the academy of a high-class brothel who learns her trade and rises to the top of her profession. This was a radical act. It gave a voice, a mind, and a sense of agency to a class of women who were meant to be silent, voiceless objects of male desire. Fanny is not an object. She is the subject of her own story, the author of her own life. Third, and most shockingly to the 18th century reader, the novel is almost completely devoid of any sense of sin, guilt, or divine retribution.
Fanny's world is a resolutely secular one. Her actions have consequences, but they are social and economic, not moral or spiritual. The novel's tone is not tragic or cautionary. It is cheerful, optimistic, and often comical. Fanny describes her sexual encounters not with shame, but with a sense of scientific curiosity, of wonder, and, as the title says, of pleasure. She is a woman who enjoys her work, and at the end of the novel, she is not punished for her sins in the fires of hell. On the contrary, she is rewarded with the ultimate prize of the 18th century novel, a happy, prosperous marriage. She finds her first true love, Charles, marries him, and retires to a life of wealthy, respectable domesticity. The novel's ultimate subversive message is that a prostitute can, through skill, good fortune, and a fundamentally good heart, find a happy ending. For the religious and moral authorities of the 18th century, this was the most dangerous idea of all. It was a story that not only depicted vice, but made vice seem pleasant, profitable, and ultimately pardonable. It was a direct challenge to the entire moral framework of the age. Faced with imprisonment, Cleland publicly disavowed the novel before the Privy Council, but it was too late. The book, The Dangerous Idea, had escaped into the world. For the next 200 years, Fanny Hill lived a life in the shadows. It was constantly reprinted in pirated underground editions, often with crude and explicit illustrations that were not part of Cleland's original, more literary vision. It became a byword for forbidden literature, a book to be hidden, smuggled, and read in secret. In the 19th century, with the rise of Victorian morality, the legal suppression of the novel became even more intense. In both England and the United States, a series of anti-obscenity laws, such as the Comstock Act in America, made the possession and distribution of Fanny Hill a serious crime. The book was hunted, seized, and burned by authorities. It was a literary fugitive. Yet it refused to die. Its very illegality made it more desirable, a symbol of rebellion against a repressive social order. The first phase of its trial was over. It had been found guilty and sentenced to a life in the literary underworld, but its battle for legitimacy, for the right to be read not as a piece of filth, but as a work of art, was far from over.